My title is, of course, an echo of Richard Baucham's Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, a book that I was astonished to discover was published 19 years ago. And it's a book that rightly caused a re-evaluation of the role of eyewitness testimony in the canonical Gospels. And as often, Bauckham upended our assumptions in New Testament studies. And here, the form critical assumption that the Gospels, especially the Synoptics, are the product of a long chain of anonymous witnesses who pass things on to each other, that the evangelists were just collectors of such traditions many years later and shaped them into books. Bauckham argued rather that there is a strong evidence of an eyewitness stratum to all four of the Gospels. And there's been much debate about Baucham's work. My view is that he's shown convincingly that the assumptions of the form critics are not borne out by the evidence, and that there is a much greater role for eyewitness testimony in the Gospels than has been previously allowed in mainstream scholarship. So I'm building on his work here. Bauckham refers only briefly to the book of Acts in his book. And so I'm going to seek to extend his arguments by considering Acts from three angles. First, I'm going to ask about the place of eyewitness testimony in Acts. Secondly, I'm going to ask about the role of eyewitness testimony concerning the Jesus stories according to Acts. And then thirdly, I'm going to ask what we can learn from Acts about the role of eyewitness testimony concerning the stories within Acts itself. Now, as is well known, generations of scholars have sought sources for the book of Acts on the, I think, entirely appropriate assumption that the author's drawn from others in compiling the book. The trouble is, nobody can agree what those sources are. Whatever material Luke draws on, he's woven it into his cloth so that it's almost impossible to identify, especially because the book of Acts is written throughout in Lucan diction and style. I'm going to argue that to consider eyewitness testimony as one of Luke's sources can help us with this question. Several features indicate the importance of eyewitness testimony in Acts. One is the importance of testimony language. Now that's signaled very early when Jesus says of the apostles that when the Spirit comes, you will be my witnesses. And that genitive mu has, in my view, a double sense. It indicates both that the witnesses belong to Jesus and that their testimony is about Jesus. I don't think we need to torture the genitive to get one or other out of it. The term martus and its cognates, the nouns marturia and marturion, witness, and martureo and marturumai, the two verbs that mean I bear witness, occur 29 times in the book of Acts, in the Nesthaiol and in the Editio Critica Maior text. This is forensic language used in courtroom scenes where Jesus' followers give testimony. It's also used metaphorically for the disciples' testimony that's given to persuade others to become followers of Jesus. And the widespread use of it is suggestive that Luke is not simply recording testimony, but actually writing apostolic testimony to pass on to others. And it's notable that Luke uses witness language as a technical term. All the early Christians are not witnesses. There are some people specifically who are called witnesses. The 12, of course, Stephen, Paul, but that's not all. Peter Bolt, who has written about this, identifies those. But I think he misses that they, in Luke 24, when Jesus meets with them after the resurrection, are also witnesses, as well as the two who walked to Emmaus. And then the group in Acts 1:6, when they had come together, and Jesus then says, you are my witnesses, may well be wider than the 11 including those who prayed in 1:14 and the 120 who gather in 1:15. The task of witness has at least 3 dimensions, I suggest. First of all, it's to testify to Jesus' ministry, death, resurrection, and exaltation. And C.H. Dodd noticed this long ago in his analysis of the apostolic preaching. Secondly, it's to testify to Jesus' holy and righteous character that produced his healings and his other marvellous deeds. And then thirdly, it's to testify to Jesus' present status as Lord following his exaltation, which calls people to repent and to trust in him. Now, that testimony is in continuity with the testimony to the kingdom of God in the third gospel. And just notice the way that Acts is bookended by references to the kingdom of God. In 1:3, where Jesus teaches about the kingdom, in 28:23, where Paul's teaching about the kingdom in Rome. And Acts bookends with those two. So what about the place of the 11 or 12 as they become? There are 4 Acts passages that signal they have a particular role in eyewitness testimony. First, there's the choice of replacing Judas. After Peter's interpreted 2 psalms as concerning Judas' betrayal of Jesus and death, and he's implied it's God's purpose to replace Judas, he's used "dei," it is necessary, which in Luke's Gospel and Acts is almost always a signal that there's a divine necessity about this. He then sets out a person specification, that it has to be somebody who's been with us, beginning from the baptism of John until the day when he was taken up from us. And that is the period covered by Luke chapter 3 to 24 and the beginning of the book of Acts. Now, that requirement means that the one chosen will become with us a witness of his resurrection. Their testimony, as Peter's Pentecost speech indicates, and his speech in the temple in Acts 3, includes Jesus' life, ministry, death, and resurrection. That is, the events indicated as qualifying them to serve in this role. Jesus' resurrection, of course, is crucial, because if Jesus had stayed dead, the New Testament would never have been written. The completion of the number of the 12 by adding Matthias is emblematic of the restoration of Israel back to the 12. And that resurrection, the resurrection and ascension of Jesus mean that restoration is now in train. The connection with Jesus' words about the 12 sitting on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel in Luke 22, 28 to 30 is hard to miss. And it's played out in Acts in the role of the reconstituted 12 as witnessing primarily to Israel, forming the core of the renewed Israel, which will in due course embrace Gentiles. And although only 2 names are proposed, it's probable there are others, perhaps many, who could have qualified for that role. Secondly, of the 4 markers of the life of the early community, the first one is the apostles' teaching. Its location as first in the list suggests it has some priority over the other 3, the fellowship, the breaking of bread, the prayers. Indeed, those 3 are dependent on the apostolic testimony for their importance. The role of the apostles depends, of course, on their eyewitness experience and of Jesus commissioning them, as we saw, as his witnesses. And in the first half of Acts, the apostles have a particular role in recognizing divine action, notably in Samaria, where Peter and John go, and in Saul's conversion, where the apostles are persuaded, actually by Barnabas, that Paul is to be trusted. Thirdly, let's consider the question of what happened when there was a dispute about the Hellenistic widows, the Greek-speaking widows, in chapter 6. The 12 call a community meeting to consider how to respond. And their proposal is that they should keep their focus on serving the word, the service of the word, rather than neglecting God's word to serve tables. The use of the cognate verb and noun, diakoneo and diakonia, is really noticeable here, because it's showing clearly that these are not two hierarchical forms of service. They're both forms of service. In one case, you're serving the word. In the other case, you're serving tables. There's no suggestion that the 7 serve under the 12. Both groups are serving the gospel and the gospel community. The 12 are responsible for the word because of their commission and their peculiar qualification. The 7 take responsibility for overseeing provision for widows, again, because they're qualified for the task, they meet the job description, and they're recognised by others to do so. Fourthly, when Peter speaks to Cornelius' household in Acts 10, he identifies himself as one of the witnesses. I am among the witnesses to what Jesus did. And he gives a mini summary of Jesus' ministry, beginning from Galilee with the baptism which John proclaimed. Now that's an interesting phrase because it echoes beginning from the baptism of John, which was the qualification that you had to have to be one of the 12 in the election of Judas. And as Borkham notes, that underlines Luke's concern that witnesses have to have participated in the ministry of Jesus from its beginning with John through to Jesus' exaltation to God's right side. So the role of the 12 as eyewitnesses is prominent in Acts, especially in the first half of the book. As you probably know, the last appearance of the group, or they're called apostles, is at the Jerusalem meeting to resolve the conditions for Gentile participation in the believing communities in chapter 15. They're mentioned with the elders, and we first meet the elders in 1130 as overseeing the Judean communities. The role of the 12, thus, is foundational as eyewitnesses, not continuing. When James is executed in Acts 12, he's not replaced. The foundation job has been done at that stage, by contrast, of course, with Judas. Now notice here that these are named individuals, not anonymous communities. It's notable that those who are referred to as witnesses are people whose names we know, even when they're said, like Peter, to be part of a group of witnesses. Now that identification is important because they need to be able to testify to the full extent of Jesus' ministry, death, resurrection, and exaltation. And it speaks against the form critical model that individual Jesus sayings and stories were passed on by particular groups for particular reasons before they were written down years and years later. The form critic's reconstruction is based on an erroneous understanding of genre, a mistaken view of human development based on ever-increasing progress, and a reconstruction of situations and events where stories were told which simply lacks evidence. So what was Luke's method? Well, Luke is one of my favourite evangelists for many reasons, but one of them is he tells us how he does his work. And he does it at the beginning of his gospel. Inasmuch as many have undertaken the task of compiling an account of the matters that have come to fruition in our midst, just as the tradition was handed down to us by the original eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, having followed everything carefully and thoroughly, to write it up for you in an orderly fashion, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may have assured knowledge about the things in which you've been instructed. The sentence's structure is a protasis inasmuch as, through to servants of the word, and then an apodosis, I also decided, having been instructed. And the key part for our discussion is this mention of the original eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Luke includes himself as part of a later generation. The tradition was handed down to us. That's a group that includes me, the author is saying. And eyewitnesses are our top tie. Now, that's not necessarily a forensic term, because the translation eyewitnesses in modern English might mislead us to think that. Loveday Alexander, based on very extensive research into usage, proposes the term is better rendered those with personal first-hand experience, those who know the facts at first hand, which of course would qualify somebody to be an eyewitness in court, but that's not the point of the tag. The phrase most probably represents one group rather than two, the autoptai, and who are the servants of the word. Think of how the apostles described themselves in Acts 6. We are to devote ourselves to serving the word. And Paul's described in similar terms, using a slightly different term for witness, a martura, in Acts 26:16. Herodotus, Polybius and Josephus use autoptai, eyewitness, in similar terms concerning personal observation of events. All of this suggests to Loveday Alexander that Luke 1:2, the eyewitnesses and servants of the word, includes the book of Acts, because Paul, she says, is the ultimate source for the latter part of Acts. And she also notes that in this section of his gospel, Luke is avoiding specifically Christian language, like martus, witness. He's using language that's at home among ancient readers, ancient historians and ancient technical writers. Also noteworthy is that it's from the beginning. Just remember, we had Arxamenos, beginning with John. So there's an echo of that there, I think. Well, pre-echo, because of course it becomes before that. And then there's the metaphorical use of parakoluthate, having investigated, having followed, with the adverb anothen, thoroughly. And that gives the sense of having become thoroughly familiar with the whole affair. That's Alexander's translation. Now, the verb itself doesn't denote research. It's about the state of familiarity that you have with the material, which undoubtedly would require research to do it. Luke's claiming thus to have accurately grasped the tradition that he's now passing on in writing. And he's not implicitly criticising his predecessors, I think, not least because on the most widespread view of the synoptics, he's incorporated a ton of Mark's gospel into it. If he thought Mark had done such a bad job, why did he copy so much of it? He regards them as having similar authentic traditions about Jesus. And when he makes his statement that he decided to write, he uses edoxen kamoi, I too decided, rather than saying, contrasting himself with them. He's associating himself with the earlier writers. Now, Alexander suggests that to compile in verse 1 implies that Luke's predecessors didn't necessarily produce written accounts. But I think the fact that he says, I too decided to write, rather suggests that some of them at least were. And by common consent, Mark is among those. So Luke's preface signals that he's ordered his gathered material with care and thoroughness, and that this material is rooted in eyewitness testimony to the events he narrates. I'm quoting Borkham here. Luke can tell the story from the beginning because he's familiar with the traditions of those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning. So what does that imply for our study of the Gospels? Acts, in combination with Luke, strongly points to the importance of eyewitness testimony to Jesus' ministry, teaching, death, resurrection, and ascension. And as Walton argues in detail, that means that some of the named individuals are being named precisely because they are the source of that story. They're the source of the information. Now, many of Walton's examples come from Mark, but there are also ones that are found in Luke alone. Zechariah and Elizabeth in Luke 1:5, Simeon in 2:25, Anna in 2:36, Simon the Pharisee in Luke 7, Joanna and Susanna in 8:3, Mary and Martha in chapter 10, Zacchaeus in 19, and Cleopas, who walks with the other person to Antioch. I suspect it was his wife. Now, those all make good sense as witnesses to the stories where their names occur, especially if, as I think, the author was in Palestine for a couple of years during Paul's imprisonment in Caesarea Maritima and had opportunities then, I think, to interview a number of people, almost certainly, I think, including the mother of Jesus. So can we use Walton's ideas in relation to stories in Acts? Are there named individuals who are sources of stories? Walton's argument makes considerable play of the distribution of names in Palestine in the Gospels by comparison with Tali Lan's database of Palestinian names. Now that's clearly less relevant and less achievable in the book of Acts, because many of the characters there, both Jewish and Gentile, are from outside the land or live outside the land. Walton includes Acts in his statistics for Palestinian Jewish male names, but alas, he doesn't differentiate the ones that come in Acts and the ones that come in the Gospels. Nevertheless, I think there are at least 3 examples of named individuals who appear in particular stories and appear to the named source of those stories. First is Philip the evangelist. He's the only individual who's called an evangelist in the New Testament. And his ministry in Samaria in 8:4-25 is groundbreaking in overcoming historic antipathy between Jews and Samaritans. And it's unlikely that such a minor character's name would be added to the tradition of the beginnings of the Samaritan Jesus community later, without some historical basis for his role. You'd have picked Peter and John, wouldn't you, if you wanted to talk about the origin of that community. And a similar consideration applies to Philip's encounter with the Ethiopian eunuch in the second half, chapter 8, which is part of the Gospel's journey to the end of the earth. Interestingly, the eunuch is never named. He's mentioned 4 times in the second half of chapter 8, and he's always the Ethiopian eunuch or the eunuch. Adolf von Harnack suggested in the early 20th century that Luke got these stories from Philip and his daughters. In Acts 21, the we character visits Philip and his daughters. And that's where Harnack suggests, and I think Harnack's right, that the source of those stories comes. Now, I'm going to consider the we section specifically shortly. But if the we sections indicate, as I shall argue, the author's presence, then Harnack's proposal becomes all the more likely. It's really easy to envisage a scenario. Indeed, my friend Conrad Gempf did in talking to me one time. He said, just imagine the scene. There they are, sitting having dinner, and Philip says to Luke, "Have I ever told you?" And the girls go, "Oh, Dad, not the missionary stories again," and roll their eyes at him. And you can imagine that happening. You can absolutely imagine that happening. But that's how Luke got his stories. And in support of Harnack's proposal, we can notice 2 passages in Eusebius. The first is where Eusebius states, with Papias' authority, that Philip is Philip the presbyter is one of Papias' sources. And Papias also says that they, being with them, that is Philip's daughters, Luke gained information. He gained information from the daughters of Philip. Eusebius also says, on the authority of Polycrates and Proclus, that Philip and his daughters later lived at Hierapolis, which is a region that's known to the author of Acts. It's in the region around there that Luke reports stories in Acts 16 and Acts 18. Now, Polycrates or Eusebius may have mistakenly identified Philip the Apostle with the Philip of Acts 8, but that's no reason to reject the other information that Eusebius reports. Second character is Rhoda the Pidiscae. She's the one who goes to the door to answer Peter's knocking after he's been let out from prison. And she's the one who goes back to the prayer meeting and says, Peter's at the door. And they say, don't be stupid. Yeah, we're praying for him. It can't be him. I exaggerate only slightly. As a Pidiscae, she was almost certainly a slave. And she's part of the household of Mary, the mother of John Mark. And her responsibilities obviously include being the doorkeeper. Luke's account indicates that she recognises Peter's voice, which is unsurprising if this large house was where many of the early Christians met on a regular basis. She seems to be a believer herself because she comes to open the door, she comes to the door, which suggests that she's present in the prayer gathering. And when she hears Peter's voice, verse 14, she rejoices. She's joyful when she hears Peter's voice. But notice that she's the only one who knows this whole story. She's the only one, apart from Peter, who encounters Peter knocking at the door. And she's the only one who can tell that bit of the story. She's the only one who talks about the skepticism. But she's then present in the room and hears Peter's account of how he gets out from prison. That's the bit before he knocks on the door. And Acts reports that prior to Peter knocking on the door, because Luke's telling the story in good order. And she's there when Peter says, share the news with others, go tell James. And Acts is then vague at the end of verse 17 about where Peter went next, which is entirely compatible with Rhoda not knowing this. Presumably, Peter went underground in Jerusalem or somewhere else for his own safety. There's absolutely no reason to name Rhoda. She plays no role in the story as Rhoda. She does play a role in the story if she's the source of it. Thirdly, Jason of Thessalonica merits some consideration. Jason enters the story of Paul and Silas's visit to the city without any introduction. The first thing we learn is that the mob attacked Jason's house. Who's this Jason that's being spoken about here? We know nothing about him at that point. And Acts at this point has given us no backstory for Jason at all. He's named with Tinos Adelphus, certain brothers and sisters, whom the mob then in verse 6 dragged before the authorities. And then in verse 7, Luke finally gets around to telling us that he'd hosted Paul and Silas. He'd not done it earlier. So it's not like Lydia in Acts 16, where Lydia invites them into the home and they then have a riot. No, we have the riot first this time, and then we discover the backstory. Now, those features suggest that Jason is a Jesus follower. He may well be Jewish. Yason is often used in the diaspora as a Greek form of Yeshua, or in Greek, Jesus, Jesus. Now, if so, he was probably a convert during the synagogue ministry that we've had in verses 1 to 4, and either then or earlier offered them hospitality. But the point to notice here is that Paul and Silas are not at Jason's house when the house is attacked. How does Luke know about all of this? How does he know about Jason being dragged before the city authorities? How does he know about Jason being forced to pay bail? Maybe Jason told him. Maybe Jason is the source of this story, because the we character is not present in Thessalonica. So at a later date, that story attached to Jason's name seems to have come to Luke. Now, there are other passages that can be explored, such as Alexander in the riot in Ephesus. And I've not yet had time to think about that yet. I'm absolutely sure there's a PhD to be written in this area. What then about the we character? There are several sections of Acts that are in the first person plural in 16, 20, 21, and 27 to 28. Now, when you do the maths, and I did sit down and do the maths, they actually total a period of about 6 or 7 months from a ministry of 10 to 12 years at that point, covered by Acts 16 to 28, roughly AD 49 to AD 60. That's really interesting, and they begin and end rather abruptly. Each of these 3 places in 16, 21, and 28 shift into the third person to narrate Paul's activities. The first 2 refer to Paul and us, or Paul with us, before then moving to Paul alone as the subject. Now, these stories contain some of the most detailed accounts in the book of Acts, such as the events in Philippi, which are reported much more fully than Paul's 18 months in Corinth or his Ephesian residency of 2 to 3 years. The we sections have about 2.5 times as many hapax legomena, words that occur only once, as in Acts as a whole. There are 111 words that are not found elsewhere in Luke or Acts, and 162 words that are not found anywhere else in Acts. Now, that sounds like a rather distinctive vocabulary until we recognise that a number of the hapax legomena are all nautical terms found in Acts 27 in the shipwreck story. So let's subtract those, and what you then discover is there are 21 words in the we sections and elsewhere in Acts, but not found anywhere else in the New Testament. There are 17 words or phrases that are only found in the we sections or Luke's Gospel. And there are 28 other words that are predominantly used in the we section and rarely in the rest of the New Testament. And when you put those statistics together, that places the style of the we sections within the range, I think, of the rest of Luke and Acts, and suggests that in their form in Acts, they come from the author's hand. So can we add the we character to our list of eyewitnesses? I'm going to spare you discussion of the full spectrum of views on the we sections. I've got an excursus in volume 2 of the commentary about that. But I do want to notice this question. I think Kingsley Barrett is right that they are most naturally seen as a claim to participation in the events. I think Bart Ehrman is right about that too, because that's what he thinks. The difference between Barrett and Ehrman is that Ehrman thinks Luke is deliberately lying, and says so in print. Ernst Henschen, of a former generation, thinks that Luke is using a non-first person source, but he's put it into first person to make it sound like eyewitness testimony. And Henschen's view assumes that first-person writing necessarily evinces eyewitness testimony, which of course was much valued in ancient historiography. But first-person narration isn't the only way, or even the commonest, of claiming eyewitness testimony. More frequently, authors begin their book by claiming eyewitness testimony and identifying themselves as witnesses of the events they narrate. And they tell the remainder of the narrative in the third person. A biblical analogue with the we sections, I think, is the first-person narrative in Ezra and Nehemiah, which in the Hebrew scriptures is one book. And there are a number of sections in the first person which are often identified as memoirs by those people. Hugh Williamson's commentary is one which argues for that. Now, it's not impossible that the author's composing acts in this way in the we sections, but it's actually rather hard to distinguish this from the author drawing on his own recollections, whether in writing or from memory or some combination, because the events of the we sections are generally highly memorable. C.J. Thornton, in his book Der Zeuge des Zeugen, has an exhaustive review of first-person usage in antiquity, and here's his conclusion. The we narrative of the Acts of the Apostles contains nothing that ancient readers would not have considered completely realistic. They could only see it as an account of the author's real experiences. If the author had not taken part in the journeys described in the we form, his accounts of them would have been lies, even according to ancient understanding. Now, there are difficulties in this view, but I don't think there are any that are insurmountable. On the voyage to Rome, Paul may have been a person of little standing, but if you're in the middle of a storm and somebody stays calm, you might well listen to them. Julius the centurion almost certainly knows that Festus and Agrippa think that Paul is innocent. And the centurion, therefore, might well take Paul's advice seriously. And if at least some of the material were written, well, could papyri survive a shipwreck on Malta? Well, Brian Rapsky notices that preserving documents in the sea is possible. Suetonius has an account of Caesar swimming, holding key documents out of the water while he was swimming. So it's not at all impossible. And it's worth noticing that Acts indicates that the shipwreck was planned for by weighing anchors and waiting for dawn and aiming for the bay. So it wasn't a sudden, disastrous shipwreck. Further, it's probable that our author would have kept copies of his most important notes and left them in Caesarea for safekeeping. The we character links to the first-person singular introduction of both Luke and Acts. I wrote, Acts 1:1. I decided to write, Luke 1:3, in similar manner to the Ezra and Nehemiah memoirs. Now, it's been common to claim that the four Gospels are anonymous, but in the case of Luke, it is incredible that Theophilus didn't know who'd written this book. It's incredible that would be possible, assuming Theophilus to be a real person. And the switch from third-person narrative to first-person plural narrative in the we section is akin to what Borkham notices in Mark, using C.H. Turner's work, where stories shift from plural subjects, they were doing this, to singular subjects, Jesus did this. In sum, I do think the we sections can be added to our list of eyewitnesses for some of the events in the book of Acts. There are a number of passages in the Pauline letters which reinforce the idea that the stories about the Jesus communities were passed on to other communities. When Paul, Silas, and Timothy write to the Thessalonians, they write to all those, to all the believers in Macedonia and Achaia, and that in every place your faith towards God has gone out, i.e. become known. Indeed, they write that it's from you, aphumon, fronted at the beginning of the sentence for emphasis. It's from you that the word of the Lord has sounded out. And the summary of the welcome the three missionaries had in 1, 9 and 10, and the gospel message that the Thessalonians received, is evidently part of the content of the message that Paul and his co-workers have spoken elsewhere. Later in the letter, they speak of the Thessalonian believers becoming imitators of the Judean believers who were persecuted by their compatriots. Well, that rather implies that the Thessalonians knew about the persecution in Judea. In 2 Thessalonians 1:4, the same trio, emphatically we ourselves, two personal pronouns, just in case you haven't got the emphasis, boast about you among the assemblies of God concerning your endurance and faithfulness in the midst of all your persecutions and sufferings which you're enduring. Stories about one Jesus community are being shared with other Jesus communities for their encouragement. When Paul and Timothy defend their ministry in Corinth, they reject the idea that they need letters of recommendation because they say, you are our letter of recommendation. That rather suggests again that others in the first century knew about the Corinthians' faith. Other churches knew about them. Indeed, the address of the letter itself is striking. To the assembly of God which is in Corinth, together with all the holy ones who are in the whole of Achaia. 2 Corinthians is not just written to assemblies in Corinth. It's actually written to a whole province of Achaia. And that suggests that the missionary duo expect communication between the Jesus communities in that region. Paul himself, in the first person singular, where he goes into the first person singular in chapter 7, expresses his own encouragement at hearing news from Titus about the Corinthians. Again, he's hearing about what's going on. And his appeal for contributions, he leverages the example of the abundant generosity of the Macedonian assemblies to encourage the Corinthians to give. Stories about one assembly are being passed on to others. Similarly, when he writes to the communities in Rome, where he's never visited, he says, your faithfulness is proclaimed in the whole world, en holotokosmo. Now that implies that at least Paul knows about their life together, and he's suggesting that the stories about the Roman Church are widespread. Now that's unsurprising when we read Romans 16, where there's that long list of people whom Paul says the church should greet. Some of them have been his co-workers. And then finally, in Colossians 1, Paul's heard about the Colossians' faith and love, which is part of the gospel bearing fruit in the whole world, and specifically in Colossae. Paul has learned this from Epaphras. Epaphras, our beloved fellow worker, who has also made known to us your love in the Spirit. Paul's never visited Corinth, as far as we know, but he's heard about them from Epaphras. And then he sends news about himself via Tychicus, who's probably the letter carrier, and Onesimus. Tychicus, the beloved brother and faithful servant and fellow slave in the Lord, whom I'm sending you for this very reason, in order that you may know the things about us and that he might encourage your hearts. With Onesimus, they will make known all the things that are going on here. It was common for letter carriers to bring news other than what was in the letter. Messages could be sent via the letter carrier. Ward Gask summarises this evidence well, I think. He says, in the Pauline churches, there was preaching about the missionary experience of the apostles and about the establishment of churches, and the spiritual triumphs of the various churches were used for paracletic and paranetic purposes. So can we trust eyewitness testimony? That's the $64,000 question, of course. Anybody can claim eyewitness access to events they narrate, but writers can and do tell events with great verisimilitude combined with inaccuracies or errors. Rainer Riesner draws on Ruth Finnegan's work on oral poetry in non-literary societies. Finnegan argues that you get a careful verbatim transmission of material if three factors are present. First, the teacher is thought to be divinely inspired. Second, the oral text has reached a fixed form, such as poetry. And thirdly, that there was a group trained to pass it on. Riesner offers 6 reasons for thinking this is what's going on in the Gospels. First, Jesus spoke the word of the Lord with authority after the manner of the scriptural prophets, so there'd be the same concern to preserve his teaching. Secondly, Jesus' self-presentation as Messiah entailed the expectation that the Messiah would be a teacher of wisdom, leading his followers to preserve his words. Thirdly, the Gospels portray Jesus as a teacher of wisdom. Even Mark regularly says that Jesus taught. Doesn't give us much of the content of Jesus' teaching, but he's really clear that Jesus did a lot of it. Riesner estimates that when you retrovert Jesus' teaching from Greek into Aramaic, over 80% of Jesus' teachings in memorable form. He's building on the work of Jeremias there. Fourthly, he says, there's widespread evidence that Jesus told the 12 to learn certain things and transmit them to others, even within Jesus' ministry. Further, Paul uses the terminology of tradition to signal careful, accurate passing on of tradition, such as with Jesus' Eucharistic words, I passed on to you what I received from the Lord, or the core gospel events and their witness, I passed on to you. The parables of the kingdom are Riesner's parade example of this. Fifthly, memorization of texts was common in first century Judaism, and poetic forms were often used to aid memorization, exactly the forms which Riesner finds in Jesus' teaching. And finally, Jewish and Greco-Roman teachers gathered students, disciples, to perpetuate their teaching. And Jesus in this way resembles the rabbis, even if he differs in other ways. Now, those points reinforce what we've already seen about the eyewitness role of the 12 bearing testimony to the life, ministry, teaching, death, resurrection, and exaltation of Jesus. So can we apply this thinking to Acts? This is where Borkum's discussion of recollective memory becomes helpful. Borkum notices that we generally regard eyewitness testimony with receptivity rather than skepticism, unless we discover a good reason to be skeptical. Quote, trusting testimony is indispensable to historiography. You can't do history if you disbelieve everything that you gather. And Borkum draws on studies of recollective memory by psychologists to identify a series of factors that make it more likely that a memory is reliable. 8 of these are relevant to Acts. First, events that are unique, unusual, or unexpected are likely to be well remembered. Clearly, lots of stuff that goes on in Acts is like that. Secondly, the salience or importance of the event for the rememberer supports the likelihood of reliable memory. Imagine being present at Pentecost. Imagine being Rhoda when Peter escapes from prison. Those are memorable events and numerous others. Thirdly, if there's emotional involvement of the rememberer, especially when there's strong visual stimulus that would be well remembered. Peter's prison escape is a clear example. Peter's bizarre vision of the sheet that came down from heaven in Acts 10, 3 times, and the voice from heaven are examples. Fourthly, the presence of vivid imagery in the story is often a marker of accurate recollection. Now, that's relatively rare in Acts, but there are examples, such as poor Peter having to keep knocking at the door to get let in, or the imagery of the Spirit at Pentecost, fire, other languages, wind. Fifthly, irrelevant details suggest accurate memory. Again, they're relatively rare in Acts, although some of the details of events in Thessalonica might fit this, such as taking bail from Jason. And the late, great Colin Hemer provided us with a mass of such information in his wonderful final posthumous book. Borkham observes that the absence of irrelevant details isn't an argument against accurate memory, since it probably indicates that the stories have been shaped by retelling to eliminate such things. Sixthly, are the stories told from a participant's point of view or an observer's point of view? And it's often suggested that a participant point of view represents better recollection. Borkham reports that distinction's more likely in the research in the case of recent memories. And there's evidence that people reporting a memory can switch from participant to observer reportage and vice versa. For instance, he notes that points of view change within stories in the Gospels, and the same is true in Acts. Think of Acts 16 in Philippi. The we character is the one through whose eyes we see the story from verses 10 to 18, but not after Paul exorcises the slave girl who delivers divination. And the we character is not present for the slave owners seizing Paul and Silas, them being beaten, thrown into prison, as well as their non-escape following the earthquake and their confrontation of the magistrates over their improper beating and imprisonment. So we now switched from we observation to Paul and Silas observation. Seventhly, the absence of specific dating information is not an argument against accuracy of memory. Its presence is likely only for very specific reasons. For instance, Borkham identifies the Jewish festivals in John as examples of that. Recollection of time of day, however, may well be accurately remembered information. Peter and John meet the man with a congenital disability at the Beautiful Gate at 3 p.m. Cornelius is praying at 3 p.m. Peter's praying on the roof in Joppa about noon. Finally, frequent retelling of a memory is likely both to hold the memory and hold it accurately. The particular role of the 12 in Acts in retelling the stories of Jesus is an example. And the evidence we found in the letters of telling the stories of some Jesus communities to others suggests that such telling was often retelling. So we've seen that eyewitness testimony is an important feature of the portrait of the earliest Christians in Acts, and that it's significant in studying the memories of Jesus recorded in the Gospels, as well as the memories of the stories of the early Jesus followers in Acts. In particular, I've argued that certain named individuals, Philip, Rhoda, and Jason, are probably the sources of the stories where they participate, as well as the we character. Rhoda and Jason appear from nowhere and disappear to exactly the same place. There's no other reason to name them in the story. We've also seen that the likelihood of eyewitness material can be further evidenced from the letters, and I've argued using work on memory and recollection by Reasoner and Borkham that draws on ethnographic and psychological study of memory, that there's a strong reason to trust the accounts which Acts gives us through the eyewitnesses upon whom it draws. Thank you.
Thank you.